Hello, Vincent Carroll speaking. This is tutorial number 42. One of the striking differences between acupuncture and Western medicine is the fact that we add in subjectivity, whereas from a Western medical point of view that does not happen. And there's reasons why we do it, and there's reasons why our Western medical colleagues do not do it. So let's explore that, because it's very important, because it's all about information gathering. And the more information you can gather and the more reliability you can place on that information, the more accurate will your diagnosis be, and the better will your treatment plan be, and the outcomes flowing from it. From a Western medical point of view, one thing I always notice is the emphasis on measurement. So if you can measure something, suddenly it's elevated in importance, and if you can't measure something, it tends to be ignored. It's not ignored because there's no belief that it's not important. It's ignored for two reasons. Firstly, it's very hard to attribute proportionality to it compared to, say, what a blood pressure reading might be. In other words, it might be something that might significantly influence or not influence at all the person's recovery. So you're reluctant to incorporate it into the medical mix. But more important than that, if you were to write up a peer-reviewed article, and if you were to allow subjectivity to enter into that peer-reviewed article, it wouldn't be published. In fact, you wouldn't even get your manuscript back. It would probably be shredded, because you've broken the golden rule. The golden rule is that you only put in what's verifiable from a measurement perspective. Now, there are exceptions to that rule, the world of psychiatry, and we'll be speaking about that in a moment. But for the most part, if you enter in a subjectivity into an area where objectivity rules supreme, that subjectivity is edited out. It's not allowed to have any credence within the medical mix that produces the diagnosis. Now, from an acupuncture point of view, of course, we do that all the time. From an acupuncture point of view, we will ask, are you happy or are you sad? We mightn't quite use those words. We'll wonder, is the person entrapped or frustrated? Is the person submissive? Is the person volatile? Is the person... You try to form opinion. It's difficult to do so, and subjectivity carries bias, carries personal prejudice, and that can easily enter into medical mix, because in trying to do your best, you might make the fatal error of comparing yourself to the client that you have the privilege of seeing, that's sitting in front of you. We only stand in our own shoes, nobody else's. So you put in checks and balances to kind of cross-check the subjectivity, just to make sure, is it worthy of admission into our medical mix. And the way we do that is we seek objectivity, if you like, to verify what we have as a subjective opinion. So tongue diagnosis will be very important. I mean, if there are red edges, you might very well hold a view that the liver is in yang overdrive. If those red edges are rolled, then you might hold a view that the person has a tendency to bottle things in and to entrap. If a person's tip of their tongue is red, perhaps with prickles, and I'm talking about very bright red, then in that case you might view the person as being spontaneous. And you will ask, at least I always ask the question, has spontaneity ever got you into trouble? And then, of course, we have to realize that from a Western medical point of view, there's a sharp division between pathology and physiology. You're either well or you're sick. From an acupuncture point of view, there's a broad spectrum that we drift into and drift out of, and what is right for one person may not be right for another person. So spontaneity might be doing things in a spontaneous way. I mean, this video is produced spontaneously 2-3 minutes ago. It was the furthest thing from my mind. So what happens is, it can be a positive to be spontaneous, but just supposing if a person went into spontaneous overdrive, physiology then becomes pathology. So the same applies to exercising due caution. There's nothing wrong about being cautious about things, but when it over-influences your decision-making and holds you back with a suspicion and an anger associated with it, then perhaps it's liverish, it's liver in overdrive, and it needs correction. But I'm very reluctant to place things in absolute boxes of wellness versus ill health, because the spectrum is very, very broad. It's a bit like the yin being within the yang and the yang being within the yin, which is one of the first laws of acupuncture that I'm sure most of us ever learned. We look for other things as well, like pulse diagnosis. But a very useful thing I find is what the needles themselves tell us. And that's why my needling technique tends to be, to say the least, robust. In other words, I really seek to get the chi. Because if somebody comes to me and I formed a point of view that their chi is down, I'm going to search for it just to see, can I find it? And if I can find it, or I have difficulty in finding it, or if it's very weak, I'll agree with the person. I'll say, yes, well, it does appear this objective evidence here matches your subjectivity in saying to me that you feel very tired. Because there's some people who might be highly energized who feel tired if they haven't achieved a vast amount of stuff. And there are other people who just do occasional tasks, and from their point of view, I mean, tiredness is something that perhaps they either always have or they simply don't recognize. So in other words, it's a subjective spectrum. So the needles will help tell you. I love in particular if you use gallbladder 34. Gallbladder 34 is an excellent point for entrapment. It's an excellent point that will immediately sort of be dynamic if the liver chi is entrapped. And sometimes, and perhaps there are people looking in here, sometimes it can be expelled as a needle. And I often find that's a very dramatic event. But I would say every second or third year, when I deeply put in a gallbladder 34, the gallbladder 34 is expelled, and the amount of energy is massive for the very simple reason there's too much energy to avail of one needle. And I immediately put the gallbladder 34 in the other side as well. It's a bit like bursting a balloon. There's so much energy coming to the needle, and of course that tells you where the person's energy is at from a liver point of view. I mean, obviously if you do liver 8 to crash down somebody with heart fire blazing, it can be an absolute massive reaction, but it's over within a second or less than a second, because again, you've released that vast amount of heart in excess for the person that might be manic. So in other words, but yet a person that might be jolly and cheerful and chatting about things and planning things into the future, that doesn't necessarily mean they're manic. So you don't know until you try it with the needle. Of course, look at the heart as well, and look at the tongue as well. I mean, but then a reddish tip of the tongue might show the person is a heart type person. It doesn't mean there's pathology there. There's only pathology there if the person causes harm to themselves or others. So therefore, from an acupuncture point of view, that's why our history taking is so much longer than from a Western medical point of view. We factor in subjectivity and we form opinion, and we test that opinion against the needles. We test that opinion against pulse. We test that opinion against tongue diagnosis in building up a profile. And then and only then do we get what is a correct needle selection. So two people come, perhaps that appear to be completely identical, perhaps they're entrapped, perhaps they're yin deficient. Supposing if a person is yin deficient and, for example, has difficulty enjoying life because they believe they're being persecuted, if that is interfering with that person's well-being, if it's limiting their achievements in life because the suspicion is overwhelming them, then that is something clearly that requires a treatment. And from a Western medical point of view, you might say, oh, well, that person's demonstrating anxiety, let's put the person on some anti-anxiety medication. But that is not what the real reason is. The real reason is a collapse in serenity and calmness. And when we understand that, we bring that back by needling those points that enhance that. REN 4, for example, but we've only have done that based on the subjective opinion that we have, listening to the subjective history that they're giving you. And then you're testing that against tongue, pulse, and what the needles say. And I often find the more excess a person is, the easier that diagnosis is, and often the less insight that person has into their own behaviour. So if a person, for example, is quite an explosive, volatile sort of person, the liver is blazing up, they may not be aware of that, or certainly they don't want to be told about that, but they're not aware of that. Whereas you, as a therapist, as an acupuncture trained person looking at that, would say, well, on the spectrum of things, while this is not affecting this person's health in an obvious way, it might be affecting the health of people around, and the person is, after all, complaining about their migraine headache. But it's not just migraine, it's yang powering up on a yang channel, but it's mainly been expressed verbally. So you have your cues there as to what to do based purely on subjectivity, because there's no objective evidence to it except what you're told. And of course, in the telling of something, subjectivity always enters into it. So therefore, from an acupunctural point of view, when we're taking our case history, we need to be aware that we're seeking subjectivity and giving the subjectivity that the person's telling you, the subjective opinion that you're forming, the same credence as the objective evidence, but you're balancing both so that one complements the other, so that you're not just making wild opinion based on your own personal experiences. You're nailing it down with objective evidence on tongue, pulse, history taking, and above all, what the needles tell us. Those are my thoughts. Thank you.